Do you feel stuck? When I was a child at Thanksgiving dinner with my extended family, I wanted to get down and play because I was bored. But my mother insisted that I sit at that table until everyone had finished eating. So I devised a scheme, a clever plan to slip out the back of my chair and to escape. However, in the process of doing this, I realized that I'd made a grave miscalculation of the size of my head, the size of my shoulders, and the size of that very small window between those metal pieces. And I got extremely stuck. So stuck, in fact, that they had to bring a power driver and take apart that entire chair. Do you feel stuck? Perhaps not stuck in a metal chair like I was, but maybe spiritually stuck. Stuck in that same old loop of sin, confess, try harder, sin. Maybe stuck between the reality of who God declares you to be as his child, as his beloved, and the struggles you face in your life and the afflictions you face and the temptations you face and your imperfections of character. Maybe stuck between the reality of promised power, promised glory, promise of change, of grace, and yet little to no movement in your Christian life. Promise of love, promise of acceptance, and yet overwhelming, crippling guilt and shame. Do you feel stuck? In 1 John, I believe, addresses this feeling of stuckness between these two realities in the Christian life. And in 1 John 3, 1 through 3, he is going to show us that first, we are God's children. This is an undeniable truth. And two, that there are a dual reality going on in our lives as Christians. But three, he is going to show us how those two realities collide in the person of Jesus Christ and what that means for us as we participate with him in that struggle. And in all of this, we're going to see that we are God's children and we are growing into that reality. So let us look at 1 John 3, starting in verse 1. And here John is going to begin by giving us an invitation involving a declaration. And he invites us, he says, see how great is the love of the Father who has lavished upon us, that we should be called the children of God. The great proof of God's love is that we are called his children. Over this past Thanksgiving, I was able to be with my sister and her 4 adopted children and 1 foster child. And I actually had the pleasure of because of COVID, being with them through Zoom over the course of one of their child's adoptions. And as I remember sitting and watching this adoption take place, tears came to my eyes as I realized that this was the ultimate picture of God's love, of his salvation. For they did not choose this child because he was a great person or that he would grow into a great or significant man. They did not choose him because he would bring them financial success or social significance. They chose him because they loved him. They chose him because they wanted him as their child. So too, God has adopted us as his children. We are God's children. John repeats this, gives an exclamation. He says, and that is what we are. We are his children, beloved, accepted, chosen. That is the reality that God has spoken over us through the person of Jesus Christ. We are God's children. But then he goes into verse 2, and he's going to address these two realities. And he starts by saying in verse 2, dear friends or beloved, now we are God's children. Just in case you forgot from a sentence ago, we are God's children. And I think John is emphasizing this and proclaiming this over and over again because we get so bogged down by the realities of our failings and our sinfulness. The fact that we are God's children becomes eclipsed by the imperfections of our character and the struggles we face and the temptations that we struggle against and our failings and our failures. We get bogged down and overwhelmed by our own sinfulness. Going back to my sister and her husband and that wonderful adopted child. When that child makes mistakes, is disobedient, my sister and her husband want to show the punishment or bring the consequences of his choices in a place of security and love. And so John is showing us that we need to stay in this place of knowing ourselves as adopted children, believing that God has declared that over us and that we are his, that we are chosen, that we are loved. And then he goes on, though. He goes on because John does not just slap on a Christian cliche or a Christian truth and then glosses over the human experience, right? Because he says this, he says, and what we will be has not yet been known. What we will be has not yet been known. See, John is recognizing the fact that there's a dual reality going on, that we are God's children, but we are not yet perfected, that we are not yet finished. If our Christian life is a house, we are built on a foundation of the gospel of Jesus Christ with him as the cornerstone. We are built on this firm foundation and we are chosen and we are loved, but yet we are just the bare bones, maybe the frame, no windows, no roof, no siding, no fixtures, nothing. We're still growing, we're still being built, but we are on that foundation. We are God's children. So John situates us in this place of the dual realities. So what do we do in this place of stuckness? How do we live our lives? And first, John is going to bring us to hope. He says, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. For we shall see him as he is. We shall be like him. All of the struggle, all of the suffering, all of the temptations and imperfections and the shame and guilt that we face washed away when we look upon the glorious face of Jesus Christ. And in that moment, his glory, like a fire, will burn away the impurities of our heart. And we will be that which we were made to be, God's children in perfect fullness. And that is our hope. That is our security. That is the foundation, or should be the foundation of our lives. The beautiful reality of God's love for us, God's adoption of us as his children. But then we may ask, what is then our role? What are we called to do in this process here on earth? Is we are God's children, but yet we're not fully realized. What do we do in this place of stuckness? He addresses this in the final verse, in verse 3. He says, everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. So we are called to purification. But going back to the house analogy, we know that we can maybe break down the process of building a house to 4 categories. Maybe there's the final cause. Maybe the idea that what a house should be, the purpose of a house that defines that it has a roof to block out the rain, that it has walls to block out the wind, that it has heat for the winter and AC for the summer. But then there's also the part of the one who makes the blueprints, the one who designs the house and how long and how tall the walls should be and what kind of materials it should be. And all of this goes into the blueprint. And then you also have the workmen who come in and actually build the house, who construct the frame and put on the siding and the shingles, and the electrician who comes in and she puts up all the fixings and wires the house. But in all those three, if you apply it to the Christian life, that's all God. Only God knows what we are to become in Jesus Christ. Only he knows the finished product of our sanctification and glorification. And it is God that has written the blueprint for our lives, our pathway to growth. It is he who guides us into certain ways. It is him who allows suffering, who allows trials in our lives to test us and to grow us. And it is God who builds us. It is his Holy Spirit who calls us and draws us to him, who works in our lives and convicts us of sin and brings us to a place of knowledge of God and experience of God. So what is left for us in this process of purification? It is the raw materials. That which is presented to build the house. The wood that is cut, nailed, and hammered. The stone that is chiseled down to the perfect size. And this is what we are. We are the raw materials that God takes, knowing the final form, having the blueprint of our growth, and then the Holy Spirit that works in us. We are that which he builds to be like his Son. And what is the job of the raw materials in this whole process? It's to present themselves, to surrender to the craftsman's hands as he or she cuts them, stains them, or otherwise makes them ready for whatever part needs to be played. And this is, I believe, what we are called to in this process of purifying ourselves, just as Christ is pure, to present ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, ready for his good work in our lives. And so I would like to end this sermon with an invitation. An invitation to first find that place of stuckness. Find that place where you are sitting in this tension between the two realities of who God has declared you to be and the struggles of your sin and flesh. And realize that both of these are true. And then in that place, look for the hope of Jesus Christ. That one day your struggles will be over. That your temptations will be finished. That your imperfections and impurities will be gone in the face of Jesus Christ. And in light of that hope, present yourself to God as a living sacrifice. Not as the workman, not as the architect, and not as the one who pictures the final reality, simply as the raw materials, presenting yourself to God to be used by him in this process. I bless you as you continue on this progressing of life, this pilgrimage of life, experiencing the love of God and finding his grace through it all. Thank you.